Hello and welcome to this short talk on William Shakespeare's Othello. My name's Dr. Rebecca Bailey and I'm a lecturer in English literature at Liverpool John Moores University, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to you about Othello today. Othello is very different from Shakespeare's other tragedies. If you think of King Lear or Hamlet, they deal with the fall of princes and kings. In Othello, certainly, there's a gesture towards this when Othello leaves Venice to defend Cyprus from the Turkish fleet. But the main focus is on domestic concerns rather than affairs of state. And I think this is what makes Othello so incredibly intense. We see this comment from a 1610 performance in Oxford, which makes no mention of Othello's blackness, which is something we're going to be focusing on, but instead concentrates on the spectacle of Desdemona murdered in her own bedroom. Desdemona, who, lying in her bed, entreated the pity of the spectators by her very countenance. As I'm sure you all know, one of the key themes of the play is jealousy. Emilia says, "But jealous souls will not be answered so. They are not jealous for the cause, but jealous for their jealous. It's a monster, begot upon itself, born on itself." I want to tease out today how Shakespeare explores this idea of jealousy in psychologically complex and disturbing racial and sexual terms. And I want to do this within the wider context of England as a developing early modern nation. So Shakespeare examining on the Globe stage and at Whitehall concerns of the cultural moment, which would capture the imagination of his audience, both royal and commercial. But first of all, a few nuts and bolts. The play itself was probably written between 1603 and 1604. It was based on an Italian novella by Giraldi Cinthio called Blee Hectomorphy, which was also the source for Measure for Measure, and this might be a play that you're also studying. Now, Othello owes much of its plot to Cinthio, but as we shall see, Shakespeare transforms this text through language, character, and complexity of outlook. Cinthio's Othello is a stereotype, black, jealous, and vengeful, with none of Shakespeare's rich complications, for instance, the beauty and musicality of Othello's language. Likewise, the Iago character in Cinthio is more straightforward. He's in love with Desdemona, which explains his hatred of Othello, so very different from Shakespeare's Iago. In terms of staging, Othello is known to have been performed at court in November 1604, known as Shakespeare in the records for this play. Interestingly, the wider conflict of the play, the fears of a battle between Christian and Turk over the island of Cyprus, would have interested the king, King James I. James had written a commemorative poem on a famous naval battle between Christian and Turk in 1571 called Lepanto, which was published in 1591. So it's a clever move from Shakespeare here, setting the parameters of the play on a topic in which the king had a personal interest. And then, of course, there's Shakespeare's choice of setting for the play, the situation of an outsider in the cosmopolitan world of Venice, a city-state often likened to London. And of course, we mustn't forget the alternative setting of Cyprus, as this is important for the play as well. A final point to remember, there are two printed versions of the text, the quarto of 1622 and the folio of 1623, and there's interesting variations between the texts. The folio has an extra 160 lines, which doesn't sound a lot, but they're quite crucial lines. For instance, the most important changes build up Desdemona's role and Emilia's in the final act, such as the Willow Song. In this talk, I really just have the time to look at the opening scene, as I think that's a really helpful way into any Shakespeare text. Within the first 80 lines, we have Iago, Othello's ensign, warning Brabantio, a Venetian senator and father of Desdemona, that an old black ram is tupping your white ewe. A really provocative sentence here with allusions of colour and age difference and animal imagery which really fills the text, suggesting something almost bestial. This is reinforced by Rodrigo, who explains to Brabantio that his fair daughter has been transported to the gross clasps of a lascivious Moor. Here we have allusions of magic, sex, a sex-mad individual with really powerful language. Iago's strategy of playing on Brabantio's fear of miscegenation, a mixed-race relationship, proves very effective. Brabantio refuses to believe that his daughter would willingly run off to Othello's sooty bosom, and he suggests Othello has used magic to lure Desdemona to him. However, Shakespeare, after starting to run with these traditional stereotypes of blackness and evil, immediately undermines Brabantio's claims. First of all, we have the arrival of Othello. He appears as an incredibly eloquent individual. He says, her father loved me oft, so Desdemona's father loved me, oft invited me, still questioned me the story of my life from year to year. We're brought up short again with the arrival of Desdemona, who insists that it's her love for Othello that caused her to woo him. She says, my heart subdued even to the very quality of my lord. I saw Othello's visage in his mind, and to his honour and his valiant parts did I my soul and fortunes consecrate. But if we read these lines carefully, they're quite unsettling. She says, I saw Othello's visage in his mind. It sounds terribly romantic, a meeting of minds. But looked at another way, she's not saying she fell in love with a beautiful black man, but rather she looked beyond his blackness. So even Desdemona, in declaring her love for Othello, highlights, albeit unwittingly, that according to the norms of Venetian society, her actions are rather unusual. One has to ask, if it wasn't for the fact that the Doge of Venice desperately needs the services of Othello to defeat the Turks who are heading for Cyprus, whether the marriage would even have been allowed. Othello has, after all, eloped with a Venetian statesman's daughter, which would be horror of horror in a patriarchal society. So you can say it's political expediency, not necessarily a vindication of Othello and Desdemona's love, which allows the marriage to be ratified by the state. So the question we need to consider is how and why do we get from this point, a couple so in love that they defy all the norms of society, to Othello murdering Desdemona and committing suicide? Well, I think we need to think about the figure of the Moor in a bit more detail. There are a range of images which Shakespeare might have had in mind when conjuring up Othello. The Elizabethans inherited from the Middle Ages an iconographic colour coding, which equated black skin with the devil and hence with moral blackness, and white with light and goodness. Accordingly, in medieval plays, the devil was portrayed as black. They'd use soot or a black stocking over the face. However, the Renaissance understood two categories of Moors, and you can see the distinction from these images. The tawny or white Moors were North African, a little bit like the Prince of Morocco who woos Portia in The Merchant of Venice. And often these figures would be dressed in white and perceived as noble and elegant. The black Moors, or the blacker Moors, with ebony skin, came from the south and west of Africa and were perceived as jealous, villainous and lascivious. And it's notable how Iago talks about Othello as if he were a blackamoor. He's a sexually active black ram with a sooty bosom. Interestingly, as Edward Berry has shown, the more racist a character is, the less they call Othello by his name. Berry says Iago refers to Othello by name only 5 times. He calls him the Moor more than 20 times. Rodrigo never refers to Othello by name, calling him the Moor twice and Thicklips once. Brabantio too never uses Othello's name, nor does Emilia. The former calls him the Moor 3 times, the latter 8. Amongst these characters, the naming of Othello becomes an exercise in reducing the individual to a class, the person to an object. When we meet Othello, however, he is calm, dignified, noble in speech and behaviour. He specifically counters these ideas of being sex mad, as he explains that his advancing years have made him less interested in sex. His language in particular is especially lyrical and charms his listeners, just as he charmed Desdemona and indeed her father. So it's very telling that characters, as Berry notes, without overt racial hostility, tend to use Othello's name more often, and when they call him the Moor, as they almost all do, they tone down the label's negative connotations through positive adjectives. Desdemona, for instance, calls him the Moor, my lord, and the noble Moor. Yet we still have this massive reversal in the text, so that by the end of the play, Othello feels absolute passionate sexual jealousy, commits barbaric violence, and speaks in a syntax which has lost all sense, talking of goats and monkeys, and handkerchief, confessions, handkerchief. His behaviour is now closer to that associated with the barbaric blackamoor than with the civilised tawny Venetian Moor. Such duality is no accident. The play demands that we as an audience are forced to consider our own perspective about the alien Moor, who is simultaneously exotic and representative, Christian and Muslim. And of course there's an increased urgency about such matters in early modern England, because this is a moment when the English nation is evolving. There was a small black presence in early modern England. Both Elizabeth I and James I, for instance, employed black musicians, and Elizabeth had a black maidservant. But although Elizabeth might have liked being entertained by black people, she made 2 proclamations, 2 royal statements, insisting that they be repatriated. In 1596, she said that those kinds of people should be sent forth of the land, and in 1601 she repeated this, saying most of them are infidels, having no understanding of Christ or his gospel. Renaissance theatre is haunted by these images of national, religious and cultural difference, provoking debate and anxiety. As Anya Lumba argues, in early modern England, the representation of outsiders, especially in travelogues and in the theatre, contributed to the creation of English identity, precisely by exploring, locating, indeed constructing notions of difference and of a hierarchy of peoples, religions and cultures. Othello, of course, is doubly other, because not only of his colour, but the fact he's not Venetian. Just think of the oxymoron of the title, Othello, the Moor of Venice. And it's this anxiety which Iago plays on. Back to Berry. Throughout the play, the naming of Othello keeps an audience subtly conscious of the impossibility of Othello's complete assimilation into Venetian society, and gives to Othello's numerous self-references, as in "That's he that was Othello," a special weight. And of course, Othello has the distinction of being the most rootless of all Shakespeare's tragic heroes. He's a wanderer, a traveller, a mercenary soldier. If we think of Lear or Hamlet or Macbeth, they're rooted in their families before everything goes horribly wrong. But Othello is completely unmoored. As Rodrigo sarcastically says of him, Othello is an extravagant and wheeling stranger of here and everywhere. So thanks for listening to this short talk on Othello. If you've got any questions, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thanks very much.